Hello, and welcome to the Innovative Mindset Podcast. I'm your host, Isolde Trachtenberg, and I am super happy that you're here. To ring in the last couple of weeks of this year, I'm going to give you encore presentations of some of my favorite interviews of the last few years. Some go far enough back that you might hear me call the podcast by its old name, The Creative Mindset. Today, author, Broadway producer, and the programming director for the famous New York City performance space Feinstein's 54 Below, Jennifer Ashley Tepper joins me to talk about her books, her love of theater, and what it's like to book and work with some of the best performing talent in the world today. I hope you enjoy the show.
The best first step is putting on a show. So what I always tell people who want to be a producer and don't know where to start is put on a play for 10 people in like your living room and serve pizza and charge $0 and see how you put the pieces together with as low stakes as possible.
Hello, and welcome to the Creative Mindset Podcast. I'm your host, Isolde Trachtenberg. In the show, my guests and I explore how we can use creativity to do our best work and live our best lives. I talk with authors, musicians, actors, scientists, and others who are all pushing the envelope to live fully, creatively, and authentically. Listen in to get the scoop on how you can do it too. Hello, and welcome to the Creative Mindset Podcast. My name is Isolde Trachtenberg, and I am so happy that you're here. And I'm really happy to introduce you to today's guest and also to meet today's guest because we've just figured out we probably have a lot of people in common. So let me tell you about Jennifer Ashley Tepper. She's the producer of the musicals Be More Chill, Broadway Bounty Hunter, and Love in Hate Nation. Her recent projects, they're part of a decade-long collaboration with the group known as Joe Iconis and Family. She's also the creative and programming director at Feinstein's 54 Below, which is sort of like Broadway's living room. It's really a fabulous place. She's co-creator of the Bistro Award-winning concert series celebrating underappreciated musicals called If It Only Even Runs a Minute, which what a great title. And she's the conceiver and director of the Jonathan Larson Project. Her other Broadway credits include Title of Show, The Performers, Godspell, Macbeth, and The Parisian Woman. As a writer, and this is another super cool thing about her, I can't wait to talk about this, Tepper has authored 3 volumes of the Untold Stories of Broadway book series. I mean, come on, how fabulous is she? Jennifer, I want to welcome you to the show.
Thank you so much for having me and for the lovely introduction.
Oh my goodness. I'm like, you're now that I know more about you, quite frankly, because I didn't know about you before a few days ago, I'm your new number one fan. I have now elbowed aside whoever was number one and I'm sitting in the front row. So I'm so excited that you're here. We know we have people in common, which I'm also, I'm looking forward to chatting about that, but I want to talk to you. Let's start right off. You've produced multiple shows. You've worked on others on and off Broadway. You're the creative programming lead at Feinstein's 54 Below. You've gotten a ton of experience in the theater world. My first question is, how did you start? What ignited your interest in performing and in theater specifically?
I grew up in Boca Raton, Florida, so pretty far away from New York City. And I never had any family who worked in the theater, but I was lucky in that my parents and grandparents really loved the theater. So I was taken to local productions and I was enrolled in theater camp at a young age. And I just loved it. I loved everything about it, but I especially loved learning about the shows. And I would see a touring production of a chorus line and be like, what else did those guys write when I was like 9? So from
Wow.
a very young age, I was super interested in studying theater. And especially, I think, because I didn't have access to New York or Broadway, I put on my historian cap at a young age of going, okay, I can't, go to Broadway, but I can get a cast recording at the mall and I can learn about the show. So that definitely sparked my interest at a young age.
Wow. So when you were in that space and you were learning about the history of theater, what was your favorite? What was the thing that made you go, and then I want to know more, and then I want to know more? Was it Broadway shows? Was it theater productions? Was it because I'm curious about the difference between, and perhaps you'll be able to enlighten me, between something like dramaturgy and theater history.
That's a great question because I think so many people think that it's the same thing, and it's of course not. I was so taken by, I think, honestly, the writing in musicals, and from the first time I heard something like Annie, which told a story and integrated, dance and character and song, all of the elements of a musical. I couldn't have defined it that way at a time, but something about the combination of elements just really moved me. And then I wanted to learn more about, again, like what those writers wrote and what those actors did, and just piece it together myself. I remember, before I'd ever even been to New York, my mom used to let me order a Playbill magazine. So I would literally get the Playbill in the mail with all the articles, that come with your Playbill when you see a show without actually having seen them. I was just fascinated. And, a huge part of what has also turned me into a historian was at that age, I was like, okay, I want to learn about the Broadway theaters themselves so I can picture what seeing these shows was like. And then when I got to New York, I would go see a show in a theater I'd never been in, and I would know, hey, these 10 Broadway shows played here before that. So I think that also, definitely influenced my brain as I was growing up.
Wow. So that's fascinating that the actual buildings, the theaters themselves play such an active role in your imagination when you were 9, 10, 11 years old. That's so fabulous. And you mentioned playbills, and I love playbills, and I now have a love-hate relationship with playbills. I don't know if you're old enough to remember back in the dawn of time in the 70s and 80s when I first started going to Broadway shows, one of the things playbills had was director's notes of the show you were seeing.
Mhm.
And I so miss that because I love getting that insight about what a director sort of envisioned for the show that they were putting on. And I was wondering from you, within that, when you produce a show, when you're actually helping one happen, do you have a vision for the show, or is that more of the director's purview?
It totally depends on the individual project. I think that each musical is in itself like just a complete new creation. It's why musicals are so hard to predict as far as like what will work or what will run. Is it just depends. I've worked on shows as a producer where similar to something that you just brought up, where we've all thought about what kind of notes should be in the program to influence the audience before they see the performance, or what shouldn't we put in the program because we want it to be discovered in performance. Certainly, I've never worked on anything as a producer where I haven't been incredibly actively involved with the director and writer to shape the show. But it's always a combination of artistic brains, and sometimes there are certain elements you'll want to have input on a production, and on another production you might go, oh, that is completely the scenic designer's purview. So it just always alchemy every single time.
That's lovely. I love the idea of alchemy because it does seem like there's so many different parts that all have to work together in concert to make a show go up. But for what you do, and it's funny to say that because I know you do so many different things, but as a producer, what does a producer do? What is involved in the producer's job for putting on a show?
It's a great question because also, there's so many producers that do completely different jobs. It's not like, if you're a waiter at an Italian restaurant or you're a waiter at, a Chinese restaurant, your job essentially has the same bones. And that's not true of producing. It's true of a lot of other jobs in the universe. But, I think what I do at 54 Below as creative and programming director is producing. And that involves completely different tasks than producing a Broadway show like Be More Chill. So, for example, on Be More Chill, it's the producer's job to oversee every element of the production, from raising the money and managing the investments to casting to the design to the writing to the marketing to the day to day hiring and budgeting. It's everything. It's really like you're the CEO and it's a company. And then something like 54 Below, which I'm running on a day to day basis, is so different in that that has a structured business model, and it's my job to basically program everything that gets onto our stage and make the decisions about how the artistic elements balance with the tech elements, balance with the budget elements. But it's not the actual day to day is so different than a show, which is the same every night because 54 Below has three different shows with three different casts of personnel every night. So yeah, and producing can be line producing, where it's just there's so many different definitions, and I think that's part of why people don't really know what a producer does.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to ask the question because I know that people, well, a producer produces. Well, what does that mean? That's one of those questions where I get stuck. I've helped mount productions certainly, and I've directed productions, but I don't have To this day, I don't really have an idea, a really intimate idea of what a producer actually does. But something that you just said really, it struck a chord with me. You put on 3 different shows with 3 different casts every night at 54 Below. What is entailed in that? How do you make that happen?
Yeah, I've been there for about 6 years now, and we typically have 18 shows a week. So some nights we have 2 shows, some nights we have three, and it depends on anything else going on in the space, like a special event or rental and other logistics. But essentially, 54 Below's programming has evolved so that it includes Broadway artists from like stars to people that are just starting out doing solo concerts, and also musicals in concert and concerts that celebrate a certain songwriter, whether it's literally Irving Berlin or the Spice Girls. So it
I
and
love
that's
it.
a like a summary of the like variety, but it goes so far beyond that. I could list like 40 different genres of show, and so on any given night, you have those three different shows in the building, and you're figuring out which audience is going to come to each show and how that impacts which time each show gets and what the ticket price is and how much you can pay the artist. So all of those things are not things that would come into play on a Broadway show. It's so different, as I mentioned. And so 54 Below is really its own unique animal. And in order to run successfully, all of those different types of shows have to be programmed correctly and also do well enough. So it's an interesting project.
Oh, it sounds fascinating and also something that it would make me tear my hair out. Budgeting in general makes me wanna run screaming for the trees. So that I'm so glad that there are people like you who can do that and do it well. So let me ask you something. When you're setting up I don't know if it's a season or if it's just year round, do you have themes like, "Oh, for the next month, we're gonna feature musicals, or for the next month we're gonna feature the variety arts," or anything like that? Do you do that, or is it more of a depending on who pitches to you or submits, "Hey, why don't we have this?" How do you decide and how do you plan out your months or your seasons at 54 Below?
It's definitely been wonderful when I've been able to theme some series, and we certainly have a lot of series that play regularly. Overall, it doesn't happen too often. I was able to do a series of new musicals in concert a couple years ago where I really hands-on produced these 10 weeks of once a week we had a new musical in concert that had never played New York, but it had a significant production out of town or a workshop, and was a worthwhile piece that deserved to be seen in New York. And among the shows that were in that series were Be More Chill, which ended up going to Broadway, and A Strange Loop, which ended up winning the Pulitzer, and all
Yay.
these new musicals that have had these extraordinary paths since then. And anytime we've done that, it's been really exciting. I try during the summer to program a series. This summer, we were supposed to have a series of like new writers in concert, which is a little different than new musicals because it's usually writers presenting a variety of their work. But we've also had a duo show series during the summer, basically during times that are a little less audience friendly and might struggle a little bit more. We try to come up with a theme, but overall, because there's so much to fill and so much of it's dependent on artist schedules, a lot of the time it's just slotting in the best stuff for each time.
And even in that, it sounds like there's so much to keep track of. Let me ask you that within either at 54 Below or when you're mounting a show on Broadway or off Broadway, what are the steps in the process of mounting a show? What do you do, and what are the steps that the show has to go through? If you could detail those, I would love it because it's something that I don't think a lot of people realize just how much goes into putting up a production.
Totally. And you hit the nail on the head with something you just said, which is that it's not possible to do all of it because there's so much. And so, such an essential part of producing, whether, at the 54 Below level or at the theater Broadway level, is surrounding yourself with the best team possible and creating a group of collaborators that can really work together. And that doesn't mean never disagreeing, and that doesn't mean never fighting about an artistic decision. It just means like you're staffed in a way that you have people you can depend on to do the best job that they can. And so, with 54 Below, so much of it is, as mentioned, there are 18 shows a week. I'm putting that together, but I'm not producing hands on, obviously, each of the shows. And so, luckily we have a number of really wonderful concert producers who, might come to me with an idea, or I go to them with an idea, and we say, okay, here are all the pieces. We want to do like an evening celebrating the musicals of Nymph, and Nymph just ended, so how can we honor those shows that played that festival? And maybe we can include this, and maybe this date will make sense, and this ticket price, and these kinds of artists. And then I'm like, here are all the things you need, go. And you trust somebody to, go and run with that kind of idea that you've set up. But they have the full authority to do it under their terms. So a lot of the times it's, trusting people and delegating in that way. And it's similar with that is something that there are parallels in a theatrical production or Broadway. You can't be everywhere at once. So at some point, you say, this is the direction I think that this kind of radio marketing should go in. And the person who's in charge of radio buys on your marketing team has that directive from you and runs with the radio buys. It's really like your job as the producer to be captain of the ship and be able to delegate.
And when you're delegating in this way, whether at 54 Below or a show, there are many elements that are the same, whether or not it's a school production or a, huge Broadway show, casting, directing, set and costume design, learning parts, blocking, etc. I know that you just said that you have a sort of a collaborative effort going on in order to put this on, but as a CEO, as you put it, how do you usher all of these things along as a producer? Do you check in with casting directors? Do you check in with set designers? Do you oversee them? How does that process flow?
A huge part of it has to do with understanding what everybody's job is so that you can be the best possible support system for them to do their own job. So, what's interesting is in writing my books, The Untold Stories of Broadway, I've interviewed about 300 theater professionals of all different kinds, from, house managers to ushers to directors to sound designers. And it's like,
Wow.
conversations that I've had with a sound designer, about their work on a musical in the 90s has helped my understanding of what a sound designer does in a way that when I'm producing a show, which is a completely different job, I go, okay, this is what the sound designer is trying to accomplish at this step of the process. And I can help them by doing X, or I can help them by not worrying about this because this is what they need to do right now. So much of it is just understanding what jobs are. And that, trickles down to every element of what theater is. You can't be a good producer if you don't understand what the merchandise team is doing, or what the costume wardrobe team is doing. So it's just about understanding. And a lot of times, like, theater is stressful because it takes a lot of time for things to come together. You're in rehearsal and you're in tech and you're in previews, and being able to understand what's just a part of the process and has to be a mess before it comes together, and what you actually need to be fixing actively as a producer is a huge part of it.
And that's fascinating to me because it seems like what you just said, and correct me if I'm wrong, the other word in addition to collaboration is trust. It
Mhm.
feels like you need to trust yourself to know what you need to do, and you need to trust the team, whether it's a set designer or somebody who's going to be running lights, that they know what they're going to need to do. How much of that do you have intrinsically, and how much of that do you build? Do you ever spend time sort of working with the team to build a sense of trust, or do you just accept everyone's going to be a professional?
Absolutely. That's a great question too, because the trust is so important and you do have to build it. And it's one of the reasons why, theater is often better when there's some kind of foundation of creation among at least some of the people who are making the thing. We experienced that in a pretty extraordinary and unique way with Be More Chill, because so much of us had been working on the show and, with each other on other projects, like in basements and barns for years. And so we got in a room for the first day of like a Broadway rehearsal process. There was a shorthand and an ability to trust that, trickled throughout the whole team, including all of the new collaborators, and created like a situation where, we knew that something would come along in a certain way because we had that initial, conversation 2 years before. So, yeah, no, I think that building that trust is essential. It doesn't mean that you have to have worked with people before, but it certainly does help. And it's why shows that are crafted, like, for example, like the 25th annual Putnam County Spelling Bee was similarly created like in a very small production in a cafeteria in the Berkshires. And so when those actors come to create on Broadway, they do have that trust. It's a huge part of what makes a lot of theater kind of come together, is if you are able to build that in certain ways with members of the team.
Sure. And that idea of building it together and knowing that you've done it together, I'm sure helps coalesce everyone. It helps everyone be cohesive as part of putting a show up. I remember doing productions in college and in high school, and whatever needed to be done, you did. You know, what it didn't matter if you were the lead in the show, it didn't matter. Whatever needed doing, you were, if you saw that it needed doing, you did it. And so now for you, uh, you've worked on shows, directing, producing, marketing capacities, title of show, Godspell, Macbeth. Can you describe how? Because I know that this sounds like a strange question, but it isn't, in that I too have many fingers and many pies. You don't do one thing. You do a number of different things. And I'm wondering, how did you, for this career that's so varied, yet seems to be so intrinsic to who you are?
So much of it was that when I was growing up, there were certain people that I read about in books that I saw were doing kind of theater jobs and had careers that didn't fit like one specific path. And, there was Ted Chapin, who's still one of my heroes, and Ira Weitzman, who's still one of my heroes. And there would sometimes be people that would poke out of a book, and I would be like, okay, that person's not, a writer or a costume designer or something that's easily defined. They're basically forging their own path, and it kind of integrate with both of those people I named. Their paths integrated theater history and like making new musicals happen. So I had that idea in my head. I don't know again if it would have been I would have as deliberately been able to say it. But for me, when I went to school at NYU, so much of what I learned during that time was that like I would have to create my own opportunities, and I wasn't able to learn such specific things I wanted to know from class. So I had to assign myself books and like go to shows and take notes on changes being made and seek out internships and kind of craft my own education. And then I just did my best to continue that after I graduated, and figure out how to, in my first years in the professional world, integrate day jobs and, paying rent with like learning from different opportunities that spanned theater history and theater producing. And so much of it is just like following your passion and figuring out ways to make that work and then turning that into, the best career possible.
And it sounds like you're thriving. I mean, the creative projects that you're taking on and that you have taken on are fabulous, and they're so much fun. And so I'm wondering, when you're doing it, like for example, I directed one show in college. Okay. I was an English drama major, but I directed one show, and I remember the thrill of seeing my vision come to life. It lives inside your head, you live it, you eat it, you breathe it for months, and then you can finally see it come together. And to me, that's magic. What's that process like for you? Do you stress about it? Do you stay zen? What's the magic for you in seeing one of your productions go up?
I what you just said made me think about the Jonathan Larson project, which was like a huge part of my life for years and still is, because that was such a process of crafting something as a director and as a conceiver that I then got to fully realize on a stage in a, initial concert production. But I think that, stressing about stuff is okay. That just means that you care about it. It's using that stress to do something productive that's really the key to it. And I think, if you really are working on something and have that vision for it, seeing that vision through often is accompanied by, trouble in putting the pieces together and making sure that everyone is seeing the same thing you are. With the Jonathan Larson project, I spent years researching his unheard songs at the Library of Congress and really diving into every single part of, his work that he left behind in order to craft the best possible song cycle of, a kind of song cycle that he would have created, that he never did as like a new musical theater writer. So unfortunately, we lost him many years ago. So I wasn't able to, collaborate with the living artist. So how do you carry on that person's vision through his legacy? And in doing that, I was so lucky to work with truly like my dream team of collaborators on the music team and on stage as actors and all over the place. But it definitely, it takes time to make people understand something that you spent a lot more time with. So a lot of the process was bringing people into that. And actually, it wasn't stressful in the way that some productions are, because everybody really did have this, was on the same page about wanting to learn about him. But it certainly was something that I felt like I stepped in the door first and had to figure out the right ways to bring each person on the team inside.
And it's interesting because within that, you developed a team, and it sounds like everybody loved his work in addition to wanting to be involved in the project. Is that the case? Or did you find people who didn't really know his work? And actually, let me just, so Jonathan Larson wrote Rent. For anybody who doesn't know who Jonathan Larson, if you're listening and you don't know who Jonathan Larson was, he wrote Rent, he wrote Tick, Tick, Boom, which is another musical I want to talk about, and with you, Jennifer. So just so you know, but as far as you people who are listening to this, Jonathan Larson wrote Rent, and if you don't know what Rent is, go find it, either a production or rent the movie. Go find it. Anyway, were they people who already knew his work, or did you have to introduce them to Rent, or who may have not known what this was going to be, and you had to pitch them on it? How did that happen?
There was sort of a range of knowledge. There are five actors who are in the show, and the actors, uh, Andy Mientus and Nick Blameyer, who were two of the five actors, like they're huge Jonathan Larson nerds. And as you mentioned, Jonathan Larson, he wrote Rent, but that he died when he was 35, right on the cusp of Rent happening in 1996, and he died very unexpectedly and tragically. And so, his show lived on, and it created this kind of new generation of theater writers and actors who were so influenced by it. And, you can see Rent in every single piece that's come out from 3 years after Rent happened to like now. It's been so influential to a generation. And so Nick and Andy were as nerdy as I was, and were always popping up with like different facts of like, oh my God, did you know that on track 7 of Rent, he does this chord and that's mirrored? And that, like, they were on the nerd page with me. And then George Salazar, who was also in the show, had done Tick Tick Boom with Nick and knew Jonathan so well through that, but did not know Rent as well. And then Krista Rodriguez and Lauren Marcus were definitely in the middle of that. So with the actors, it was an interesting thing of people came to it with different perceptions of Jonathan's work. And that was actually really helpful. And then Charlie Rosen, who's the musical genius behind creating, a lot of the songs were demos that were Jonathan Larson and a piano in the 80s in his apartment that no one had heard. And Charlie took all these demos with me. And what we tried to do was create the kind of song from them and the kind of arrangement that Jonathan would have conceived had he gotten to fully orchestrate it. So we weren't like taking a Jonathan Larson pop rock song and turning it into a jazz song. We were more looking at a song and going, oh, Jonathan was clearly influenced here by like Billy Joel and by Into the Woods, and taking the elements that were influencing him and turning that into a song with instruments and arrangements and actors. And Charlie, was not as familiar until we started working on it. So it was like a big melting pot of people who came to it with different perceptions of Jonathan's work, and who, had conversations together to try to create a new show of his work.
Wow. And what happened to the show? Like, you produced the show. What's next for it? Is there something next? Is there something in the hopper for it?
Yeah, so the show happened at the end of 2018, and it was wild because it happened right in between Be More Chill off Broadway and on Broadway, and half of the people involved also were doing Be More Chill together. So it was a very, very heady time, but we were so, so lucky in that Ghostlight Records and Kurt Deutsch had us do a cast recording. So we were able to capture it on an album. And the album, 54 Below's week of performances were so magical. And there was something in the air that, people were telling me all the time, like, I've never felt anything like this in the room. So I'm so grateful people got to experience it live during the concert premiere. But we were also equally lucky to have this album go out in the world. So, like, thousands of people have heard these songs that had never been heard before, and that could not actually come to 54 Below. And we've been able to put out a lot of content online. And as far as the future of it, we're actively working on the next step forward on stage. So, we did that concert premiere to see what the bones were. And now it's like, how are we going to put that on a stage in a theater and hopefully have a way so that after that happens, that productions can happen everywhere and sheet music can get released, and this can, be sent out into the world in an even bigger way.
Wow, that's so exciting. That's amazing. And it's great that it's going to keep growing, that certainly his talent remains alive as long as people are singing and listening to his songs, which I think is, to me anyway, part of the result of putting this production together. And you mentioned Krista Rodriguez, and this brings up the tie-in. We were chatting before we started recording the show that we know people in common, and it's so funny because Krista Rodriguez originated Wednesday Addams in the Addams Family musical. The music and lyrics were written by my high school leading man, Andrew Lippa. So it's great. Yeah, Andrew and I did all of our high school shows together, with the exception of the very first one that I ever did. It was the Fantastics, and Andrew was El Gallo, I was Bellamy, and Jeffrey Seller producer of Hamilton and Rent and In the Heights and you name it, Avenue Q. And he was Huckabee, so I got to play in the same show with I like to say that I knew Jeffrey back when he was Jeff, and that's the that's the that's my claim to fame. But yeah, so what is your connection to Jeff and Andrew and or Jeffrey, I should say, and Andrew now? Do you collaborate with them? How does that flow happen for you? And how do you collaborate with people when when you're starting to run a show? How do you develop and forge those relationships?
I think one of the luckiest things for me in my career so far is that I've been able to have the opportunity to really come up together with my peers and to work with people, when they were first starting out, just like I was, and see them, as you mentioned, similar to what you've experienced, like blossom into different kinds of artists and have these extraordinary opportunities. So, Krista is someone who I worked with 10 years ago, and who, we collaborated on a lot of Joe Iconis's concerts and projects like that together. And getting to see her and so many other people in that group realize even further, opportunities has been so great. And then with people like Andrew and Jeffrey, who, I grew up listening to their work or really like worshiping their producing. It's been so exciting to get to collaborate with people like that at 54 Below and on my books and on theater projects, and go like, oh, I'm working hand in hand with these people who I once really looked up to. So with Jeffrey, it's interesting because my actual first professional job was as the intern on Title of Show, which then turned into being the director's assistant on Title of Show when it moved to Broadway. So right when I was a senior in college, and then the year after I graduated, I spent a lot of time in Jeffrey Seller and Kevin McCullum's producing office. Um, while In the Heights was going on and Rent was going on and Title of Show was going on, and so getting to be amidst that, for that kind of pivotal year was really exciting. And I was so honored. Like Jeffrey came to see the Jonathan Larson project and was so lovely in talking about Jonathan. And I've definitely read a lot of their correspondence from before either of them, hit, so to speak. So
Mhm.
it's always exciting to kind of work with people at different levels in that way.
Oh, that sounds what a ripe time to jump into living your dream. That's so wonderful. Let me ask you though, what would you say to someone who wants to be, they're about to graduate from high school or college and they want to become a producer? What's the best first step? How would someone just getting started begin? Not maybe 10 years ago, but today. What do you think is the best step for someone who wants this as a career?
The best first step is like putting on a show. So what I always tell people who like want to be a producer and don't know where to start is like put on a play for 10 people in like your living room and serve pizza and charge $0 and like see how you put the pieces together with as low stakes as possible. And then the next time you do it, it'll be in a rehearsal studio and you'll charge $10, and then the next time and the next time. So it's just a matter of getting started and not being intimidated by step 20 when really you just need to start with step 1 and find the people that you want to collaborate with and find the show you want to do and figure out how you're going to be a producer and fit the pieces together. But that said, my advice in this exact moment, is probably different from that advice, because as opposed to 6 months ago, or hopefully 6 months from now, and that'll be good advice. Right now we obviously can't gather a bunch of people to eat pizza and do a reading. So much of the best advice right now in this exact moment, I would say, has to do with educating yourself. And anyone in the business, but especially a producer, as I said, one of the best ways to arm yourself is by understanding all the different jobs in the theater. And that's why, like we chatted about, I've been reading so many books during quarantine because I feel like equipped being like able to be equipped with knowledge is some of the best, like, one of the best things we can do right now so that we're prepared for what's next in the theater. So like an aspiring producer who's able to read a book about like a producer from the 50s, or the way that theater worked in the 30s, or the way that, someone talked about doing a show yesterday and wrote a book about it, like all of that is going to be so helpful for a future producer.
That's fabulous. And you mentioned, and I love this idea during the quarantine, which is where we are now, you have set yourself a goal to read 100 books. First of all, where are you in that goal? Because it's a fabulous goal. And what are you reading right now?
I have read about 45 books so far. So hopefully we'll get to that 100 book goal. But what's interesting is like some of the books are really, I think, it's clear how they would be constructive. I just finished reading a book about Ziegfeld by Ethan Morden, which was fascinating. And it actually took a while to read because on every page I was like, oh my God, I want to know more about that. And so I started doing some research. And as soon as you start like looking into another time that seems so remote and so different from what we're living, you discover that there are all of these similarities and things that they did that could be tried in a new way now. It like blows my mind how I'll be like, oh, in the 1890s they tried advertising in this way, and how would we do that now? And nobody's doing that now, and would it work? So it's so wonderful to have books kind of spark those revelations right now. But that said, some of the books I'm reading are novels that seemingly have nothing to do with the theater, but I feel like as long as your brain is working to digest information and words, like you never know how it's going to positively impact you. And I've also been doing some writing and doing other things, but I found that focusing on reading at times has really helped me find something constructive to do right now.
I love that. I mean, as we were chatting about reading earlier, and what you just said really sparked something in me because it sounds to me like you have an insatiable curiosity and a, oh, I wonder what this is. Oh, wait, what about that? What do you think accounts for that? Because curiosity to me is one of the most important qualities we can strive to possess. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on curiosity and what it means to you to be a curious person.
I think that honestly diversifying your interests is a big part of it because, the year that I produced a Broadway show and an off Broadway show and a show out of town, I wasn't reading at all. And like, I love reading and I love it for all the reasons I just stated. And during that year, I was so completely consumed with producing on stage and 54 Below that I wasn't really able to do it. And so then when I returned to reading, I was, so much more curious because I had taken that break. And I find that that's true on a micro level as well. Like a huge thing that feeds my ability to be like, okay, I'm programming 18 shows is that, yesterday I was doing something totally different, interviewing people for my book. It's the way that, if you're doing one thing all the time, I think it's harder to remain curious about it. And if you're attacking things from such different angles of like, it's all theater related, but some of it's history, some of it's the present, some of it's producing, some is writing, you're able to put on different hats within that and they feed each other.
And that idea of to me, it's sort of it eggs it on, oh, and it leads to the next question, and it might lead to the next question, and I love that aspect of being curious, and also sort of feeding that hunger to know more, which I think is great. And I would love to, if you don't mind, switch gears a little bit and talk about your writing, because it sounds to me like you were curious about what you started writing about, and that's what got you going, because you're telling the untold stories of Broadway, and you've had, I think, 3 volumes already. And tell me, what is the series about and what inspired you to write these stories?
The Untold Stories of Broadway is basically, it's a series of books about the Broadway theaters themselves that use people's personal stories and my own discoveries to tell those stories and really bring the theaters to life. So, as I mentioned, I've interviewed like 300 theater professionals in all different fields. And then the kind of way that the books are created is wrapping that around the specific theaters that each stories took place in. So, there's a chapter about the Richard Rodgers Theater that talks from the perspective of someone who did 1776 there in 1969. And then you're hearing from someone who did, in the Heights in 2008. And both of those stories take place in the orchestra pit. And so, how do the physical spaces impact the way that art is created and the way that it lives on and the way that, we occupy these spaces that have been so important to history? So, the books definitely stem from, as I mentioned, like my fascination from afar with the theaters themselves, since I wasn't able to actually be inside of them. And then when I got to New York and started really learning about how different the theaters are from each other and how the real estate impacts the art and how the history of like lost theaters and theaters that we currently have impacts Broadway as an art form, it all really interested me. And during my first time working on Broadway on Title of Show, I spent so much time at the Lyceum thinking about people that had been there before and how they'd occupied the space. And that was a huge part of my inspiration for the books, which I always imagined that I would write at some point, but ended up happening, when I was fairly young, like in 2013, when I started writing them. I really feel like even, 7 years later, I'll look back on the first book and go, oh, that's such a different perspective than one I would have now. So my own, it's like gonzo journalism, right? It's like I put myself in the center of it and was really a 26-year-old experiencing it and writing about it and working on the fourth book, which I have done a good deal of writing for during quarantine, it's such a different perspective to be writing about it as someone 7 years older in the midst of this specific moment for the theater. But I'm still writing about, the same years of history that people worked in these theaters. It's such an interesting jump for me in that way.
It's so interesting what you just said. It's like looking at a gem, but from different facets. You're looking at the same thing, but from different perspectives as you grow as a person who's involved in theater, but also as you grow as a person living today. We're in a very different time than we were even 10 years ago. Heck, even 6 months ago. So it is so different. And yet it sounds like it informs what you're writing. Does this sounds kind of like a strange question, but I'm going to have to ask it. Do the stories bounce back on you ever? In other words, you bring a different perspective to the story as you're writing it, but does the story ever inform, as you do the research or as you do the interview, does the story inform your view on life and on your profession? And if so, how?
Definitely. I think a huge part of it, separate from, the whole learning more about sound design and that making me a better producer, that's a huge way that I think it does impact on a, day-to-day basis. But I also think just hearing things from different perspectives and the way that doing this kind of project has allowed me to do, it really like makes you internalize the fact that there are usually almost never good guys and bad guys. It's not that clear in life, not just in the theater, but in any situation. There's such a need, a human need to go, this is wrong and this person is wrong. And you really go, oh, there's so many different ways to look at the scenario. And like people need to try to understand each other's perspectives to actually solve anything constructively. And when you interview multiple people about the same show or the same theater or the same profession, you really start to see that nobody is wrong, that people just have these different ideas, and how do you like negotiate those with each other. So I think that's been something that's reflected back on me a lot. But also, in actual concrete stories that people have told that have impacted this time, I found myself now, editing and reading stories about theater during 9/11 or other moments of crisis, and really seeing the parallels as to how theater continued and how people handled certain problems. So that's been interesting. And I also, in writing the fourth book, I've come upon a lot of things that happen in certain theaters that I don't think I would write about in the same way if we weren't in the moment we were in. I discovered a show called The Medicine Show, which ran during the Great Depression and was very much about public health, and started really researching that and writing a big section about that for the next book. And I don't know that that would have sparked my brain in the same way if we weren't living through what we're living through.
And it's so interesting that the environment around you impacts not only how you write, but exactly what you end up choosing to write about. That's really fascinating. And I'm glad that you're able, sort of to stay open to that, to being moved by something new. That's a lot of people, I think, might have a harder time with that, and have, this is my vision and this is all I'm going to do. And it sounds to me like you are, again, that curiosity comes into play, and it's it's open. And this idea of history through the eyes of a theater really interests me. I don't know if you saw, maybe you were in the audience that night, I don't know, but they did that thing at the Richard Rodgers, the Hamilton cast sang something from a chorus line, and then they brought up the original cast on the 40th anniversary of Chorus Line, which I thought was just brilliant. And that there was this touchstone of history that we were able to see then and now. When you do this, when you write these stories, how much of that touchstone is what's sparking you, and how much of that touchstone are you trying to bring through to the reader?
It happens so naturally. It's really quite amazing how that has really happened in an authentic way in each chapter. It's interesting. The Golden Theater is in this next book, and the Golden Theater was the home of falsettos when falsettos first came to Broadway, which
Mm.
was in the early 90s when the AIDS crisis was in a different moment than it is now. And being able to interview people who were there for that and how audiences reacted to a show about the AIDS crisis is really chronicled in that chapter. And then in that same chapter about that same space, I got to interview people about the Normal Heart, which happened, multiple years later and in a different decade when AIDS was considered a quite different kind of crisis. So being able to go, oh, these two shows both occupied the same place, both talked about the same, crisis and virus and public health issues, but in the shows are totally different. The people are totally different. The year is totally different. And yet, how does the energy of that space impact those pieces of art? So there's so many ways that you end up finding these little connections. And it's interesting, with a lot of these theaters, hundreds of productions have played them, and there would be no way to talk about all those productions. So as you said, as a historian, you start to realize, oh, like how did authors write books that picked which shows to talk about and which shows got left out? And so a huge part of being a historian, responsibly is going, oh, maybe even though such and such show ran less performances or, was technically less well reviewed by critics, how do we integrate them into the story because they had, six, female members of the creative team, or they were addressing this topic that shows hadn't addressed yet, or all kinds of reasons why something might be worthy of being covered, or being part of a history book. So you really start to think about why we're writing about what we're writing about in the history books as well, and how that impacts how theater continues.
And that's interesting that you said that, because what that sparked in me is what you said about, the show being worthy of having attention paid to it. And that brings me to the concert series. If it only even runs a minute, talk about that for a minute, because I think what a fabulous, fabulous thing to do, and to decide that this is something that you want to bring to people's attention. What is, if it only even runs a minute, and what made you, and it sounds like you've already answered that question, but I'm still going to ask it again. What made you decide that this was something you wanted to do?
Underappreciated musicals were such a huge part of my DNA from the first moment I discovered theater, because for me, again, like growing up in Florida, mainly with cast recordings as my point of entry, I would hear something like Merrily We Roll Along, which is still to this day my favorite musical. And to me, that would be equal to something like Annie. They were both just an album that I had. They were both telling a story. They both, had characters I was interested in, and a story and plot I was interested in. And so for me, it didn't matter that Annie ran for years and was a huge hit, and Merrily Roll Along did not run for as long. To me, they were both just musicals. So really getting to kind of discover shows from their recordings made me start everything on equal ground. And then you go, okay, so like these shows that happen to not have as long runs in their initial productions, it doesn't mean that they're not worthwhile, and it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be done again in productions or explored in concerts. And so that's really part of what inspired If It Only Runs a Minute, was going, how do I make more people love these shows that I love and that they might not have heard? And gathering, original cast members and writers and people to not only recreate performances and perform new renditions of songs, but also to tell stories and to let people know like how these shows that might not have gotten a fair shake their first time around were just as worthy. It was just a huge passion project, and I've been doing it for about 10 years. And actually we had our first themed edition, which was supposed to honor the musicals of Hal Prince, who specifically was such a legend in our field because he created so many risky shows. And as with any long career in the theater, a lot of them were gigantic hits and a lot of them were not. And so we were going to explore a lot of his shows that were, really worthwhile and didn't run for as long. And that unfortunately has been postponed, although we will do it at some point. But I think that the touchstone of musicals that are underappreciated has really helped, my sense of creating new musicals evolve. Because, basically, there's so much to appreciate. I mean, honestly, like cast recordings from underappreciated shows are among my favorites.
Oh, I love it. I love it. And Merrily We Roll Along is, I love the show. And it's funny. I was living in DC in the early 90s, and there was a production with Victor Garber, who I didn't actually know yet, but I saw that. It was at the Arena Stage, I think. And I saw that show and I was like, this is great. I love yeah, you've got good taste, I have to say. So let me ask you a question. What draws you to a show? Is it the music? Is it the book? What makes you go, ooh, this is awesome. I love it.
I think that a lot of it has to do with both feeling like I'm hearing a story that has not been told before, and also in the craft of the way that the story is being told. And that sounds pretty, basic bones, but with a lot of shows that I found myself responding to, it's really in the fact that like the lyrics for the songs could not be from any other show. They're very specific to those characters. And I think that's, certainly like a hallmark of musicals in 2020 as opposed to musicals in 1930 or something. But for me, like my favorite shows are really specific, and often even feel like stories about real people. I think that with shows like Merrily, which is like a favorite of mine, and other favorites, I'm like, oh, those are actual human beings that even if they didn't exist, they could have existed. I tend to respond really well when it's a show that feels like real human beings.
That's so interesting. My favorite show, it doesn't have any human beings in it.
What show?
Yeah, no, my favorite show is Wicked, and they're all, fairies or whatever, so, or munchkins. But yeah, it's so I love that you said that it's real people and their process, and what is it? I think Oklahoma was the first show that actually had songs that pertained to the story and were part of the story, and, did you see the production that just closed, I think, in January? Did you see that production?
I did. It was remarkable. I think
Ah,
that it's something I've been thinking about it more during this time. But as far as like the history of the musical as we know it, Showboat, which was 20 years before Oklahoma, was so important in terms of integrating the elements. And I've definitely been studying a lot during this time the shows that came before even Showboat that started to integrate the elements and led to the art form as we know it today. Did you see that production?
I did. I've fangirled all over Patrick Vale since since that since that seeing that production. He was, wow, was he brilliant? I mean, everybody, the whole show was great. I thought it was terrific, but I just his Judd Fry blew me out of the water. It was amazing. So yeah, I saw I saw it and was just sorry I didn't get to see it more than once. So let me ask you a question. When you're in the process of this, when you're in the process of doing research, when you're in the process of the beginning work on producing a show, what are your first steps? What is the first thing you do? Do you get curious about it? Do you have a vision for it? What is the very first step that you take when you begin a new project?
I think that like all of the projects I've worked on like most thoroughly have a different answer to that. So
Mhm.
much of the time, the initial seeds come from before you're ever actively working on it. Like so many of the things we've just chatted about, I'm like, oh yeah, the seeds for my book were planted before I ever thought about, writing that book. Or, oh, the seeds for a concert series about underappreciated musicals were planted, years earlier when I was just learning about them. So I think so much of it just has to do with like staying curious, as you said, and the first step is often, learning about something or really responding to something that you're letting yourself experience without any pressure to create something from it and just seeing where that leads you. And I think that's like a good lesson for me to remember and for other people maybe during this time, which is like there's a pressure for some people to create and to like write something and to make a new thing. But so much of what's going to help create stuff is like incubating your interests. And whether that means watching movies or reading or just like learning about something, I think that the first step is often just like cultivating your natural excitement for what you want to make.
Absolutely, and it's funny. I was interviewing a mystery writer for the show last week, and we were talking about writing, and he said, even when you're not writing, you're still writing. And I said, yeah, you're percolating. And he went, yes, that's exactly what's going on. And I think that's what happens. You need time for sort of your subconscious to bubble around and come up with the inspiration and with the focus and with the ideas. And if you're constantly writing, I don't think you're giving yourself enough time to percolate. So that's lovely that you honor that in your process and in sounds like in other people's process as well. So let me ask you about your favorite shows that you've worked on. What made them your favorites and what are they?
I have spent like lot of the last decade collaborating with Joe Iconis, who's, a musical theater writer who I work with all the time. And from my first moment collaborating with him when I was first entering the industry, I just thought, like, oh, this person is writing musicals and characters and songs like nobody else is. And I really responded to the fact that, he was writing for today, but also integrating so many things that I love about like the classic elements of the musical. And so we've worked together on so many shows and concerts and albums, and so much of like the last year and a half of my life was spent with a lot of those things fully coming to fruition, with finally getting a show to Broadway together and finally getting a show to off Broadway together. And so much of what like makes me passionate about his shows continually is all of those things when I first started out, but also like the group of artists we've been able to bring together to, create them like as a collaborative family. And so we have this, group of people called Joey Coniston Family who we do concerts of 54 Below, and we do all kinds of projects together. And it's just grown over the years. And certainly, like a lot of the things I've been most passionate about have been created with that group.
Oh, that sounds lovely. It's great to have collaborators that inspire you and that you can work together. And it's interesting to watch within that when you're collaborating. What are you doing? This sounds kind of a strange question since nobody's hanging out together, but what are you doing together? How are you using technology, for example, to maintain those collaborative efforts? And if you are, I don't know if you are, but if you are, how are you doing that? How are you incorporating the pandemic and technology to keep creativity going forward?
I've thought a lot about the shutdown and the quarantine situation right now happening in 2020 is so different from what it would have been, 20 years ago in terms of so many things, but in terms of like artists staying in touch and learning and creating, there's so many resources that we have right now that wouldn't have been the case even 10 years ago. And so we actually had an album come out of Broadway Bounty Hunter, which was a show that we all created off Broadway last year, and just being able to do pretty much everything we would do if we weren't in quarantine, from having like a virtual listening party to editing the album together to doing press and social media about it. There's so much that happens on the internet, and it's so much of how you reach your audience now that we were really able to collaborate in pretty much the same way. It would have been lovely to sit in a studio together and listen as opposed to listening at our computers, but at least we had the option to have that kind of fill in, whereas it wouldn't have existed before. So I think that the technology we have right now is pretty extraordinary to keep us connected and moving some things forward.
I think it's so wonderful. Yeah, I agree with you completely. And it allows ingenuity in a different way as well as in sort of some of the same ways. Like, yeah, we don't have to all be in the studio together. We can be sitting on Zoom and recording and listening and giving feedback and all of that. And it's amazing to me that technology is allowing this. And I personally am super grateful, or this podcast would not exist right now. So that's a lot of what I find myself grateful for. But when you're talking about this idea of the state of theater during the quarantine, during the time when we're all sort of sheltering at home, what is the state of theater right now in your mind? How are things? Where are they? Where is the theater? Broadway or touring companies, all of that. What's happening? If you can give an opinion on that, I would love it.
I think that right now the bottom line is like we're not creating theater and we won't be able to create theater until it's safe to do so and until it's financially feasible to do so. And all of those elements will hopefully come together to build a new future, as soon as we can. But for now, so much of what's happening, all of the online content it's incredible that it exists and it's wonderful in so many ways, but it's not actually theater. And I think everybody does know that. But that said, theater is about creating a song and putting it on the internet and having that influence the way you're writing your next show or reading a book that informs the next production you're doing. Like there's so many ways to stay active and creative and artistic, but I think all of it, hopefully is being done with an aim as far as like what we actually do when theater can open up. And so, I think every show and every like kind of creative is having all these conversations about how do we move forward, but the bottom line is that like nobody actually knows because so much of it depends on public health and the government. So, the holding pattern can be really scary for artists, especially because of the whole like, how do we pay our rent with no industry? But honestly, I think that like the way forward is just by continuing to ask questions and like figuring out how to stay active in your brain while we're actually not able to create theater.
And it's exactly that. Again, we're percolating. Everybody is either hibernating or percolating, but things are still happening, inside you. If you're just if you decide, I'm teaching, for example, a singing class every Friday. You can show up on my Zoom live, and I teach a singing class. And I've got some people who are off Broadway performers and people who are sort of folk musicians and various other people who want to keep their skills up. They want to keep their chops. So they're coming and we're we're actually learning songs. And I think people are doing that. I think that idea of maintain and grow, and you don't have, yes, we're not doing actual theater on a stage, but you can keep building your skills, you can keep learning. And I think that's fabulous for when it does open back up. I mean, you have to understand, I just this almost a year ago now, in almost literally June 1st last year, my husband and I picked up our lives and left DC and moved to New York because I finally was like, I have to live in New York. I have to be near New York theater. And now of course, and he's like, how do you feel about the fact that there's no theater? And I'm like, oh, there's theater. It's just right now it's a different part of theater that's going on. There's other things that are going on. People are writing. I think there's going to be a huge creative sort of burst once things open back up. What are your thoughts on that, as far as when things are lifted and when it's safe to be outdoors and be together again? What do you think is going to happen to theater and the art form itself?
Yeah, I think that one of the main things we have to remember is like the best lesson in theater, separate from the quarantine, is being ready to meet the opportunity when it occurs. And, in normal life, that means like honing your skills so that when the right audition happens, you have the right skill set and the right confidence to get that job. And I think that's applicable to right now as well, because whatever you're doing in quarantine, whether it's like writing a new musical or whether it's taking care of your mental health, you're doing the thing that's going to help you meet the opportunity when it's open. I think the weird thing about the specifics we're living with right now in reopening is like, yeah, I mean, there could very well be far more musicals or plays or pieces of art than there were a year ago because people have had the time to write it. But it's we shouldn't be discouraged if we don't see that happen right away as far as what's being created, because the main thing is that like the only way that theater gets made is by people giving money, whether it's for-profit theater or nonprofit theater. And the way that the financial, moment we're in right now is going to impact the amount of shows that are able to get put on, and the way that the number of audience members who have disposable income and feel safe coming to the theater is going to be regrown. It's going to happen gradually, and there's going to be so many less fewer shows when we reopen than there were when we closed, and that's probably going to be true for a while. And that doesn't mean that there wasn't an incredible, creative groundswell, or that there's not a new era that has amazing, shows that are coming our way that do new things for the theater. But it's not going to happen immediately when things reopen because of all of the circumstances. So I think that that'll be an interesting thing to see, how that happens moving forward.
That's a really wonderful point. And this idea of moving forward, where do you see theater going? After the quarantine, after all of this, what are the possibilities for the art form as we move further into this century?
I mean, they're honestly limitless. Like there's no way of really putting a limit on what we can do in a space where you're telling a story to other people, live with other people next to you. So, I don't know that it's ever possible to predict in any moment. I think a lot of people are going like, oh, will we see more, upbeat people want to just feel joy musicals like during the Great Depression? And I always have to go, no, at the same time as that was a large part of the escapism that we associate with the Great Depression had, political musicals, and it had all kinds of different types of art. So I think one of my favorite things about theater and about musical theater, especially, is like all of those things can exist simultaneously. And it's not necessarily like a trend, doesn't mean that that's the only kind of show that exists. So I think that, we'll see so many different things. And I sometimes predict, and then I'm like, oh my God, I don't even, there's not even possible to kind of see where we're gonna be 10 years from now.
And that's likely true. I mean, there's so many things that we were just certain were going to happen that didn't, and so many things that have been such a surprise as we've gone. And that's not just about theater. Time marches on, but it often has a lot of surprises along the way. So that, I think, that's a truism for the ages. So let me ask you a quick another quick question. And I know I keep saying that, just a few more questions, but
Oh no,
this
absolutely.
so within this idea of moving forward, what would you say to young performers, not so much producers or even directors, but performers, people who are listening to Hamilton or Wicked or Dear Evan Hansen, or whatever show it is? It's funny because one of my voice students before I left DC, she wanted to sing. They actually now they wanted to sing Michael in the Bathroom, and they were like, "Well, no one's going to know this show." And I'm like, "Yeah, but it's still a musical, and even if they don't know it, you should put it out there." And they're not necessarily going to become a performer, but boy, do they love musicals, right? They really, it's sparks them like crazy. So to encourage someone like that who just loves musicals and would want to perform in them maybe somehow, what would you say that they ought to do?
That's like I think been one of the most rewarding parts of writing my books is getting to connect with young people about all the different jobs that there are in theater separate from being on stage. I always think it's so interesting that like you can't be the publicist for the high school play, so people don't know that being a publicist is a thing you can do, or you can't major in being an agent, but agents are, there's hundreds of them and they run Broadway. So I think that just figuring out that there's other jobs and kind of trying to learn what those other jobs might be is a huge moment and a special thing that you can do for yourself as someone interested in theater who might not find a career on the stage. But I think also, especially in the next couple years, as the theater industry tries to rebuild and we find that there are less jobs, hopefully for a temporary period of time, I think the best advice for young people is like, a, don't be discouraged. Like, this doesn't mean that you'll never have a job in theater. It's just what the moment is that we're living in right now. And B, like, find other things that you love to do. And I don't mean that it has to be like a fallback career, which has, a negative connotation, but, survival jobs in New York are going to be just as hard to find as theater jobs for a while, with all of the restaurants that are closing and all of the types of jobs that are, going to have less people able to do them. So I think that finding skills and interests that you have that can help pay the rent while you pursue your interest and your skills in theater, it's going to be such an important and essential part of the next few years as young people who enter, the theater business try to figure out making a life for themselves.
And that right there, this idea of a survival job, I think it's so important. And we do have this, there's almost a stigma around it, but not in New York. Many people have, they call them your day job, but it's a survival job. It's the job you work, just for anybody who's listening who doesn't know what that is. It's the job you work while you're in the process of building whatever creative career you're going after. It might be on, Broadway, it might be as a painter, it might be as a musician. That part isn't as important as the fact that sometimes you're going to have to pay the rent. And then, well, actually, you're always monthly, you're going to have to pay the rent. And you might live with 15 roommates, but you still are going to have to come up with your share of the bedroom that you share with 5 people. So as you're growing, as you're moving along. So you've answered the question beautifully for young performers, but what about older people? The actor John Mahoney, I think, started when he was 56 years old or something like that, and Rodney Dangerfield also started very sort of late comparatively speaking. And there are lots of people, I think, right now during this shutdown who are really thinking about, well, I'm so much like, yes, money is tight, but I'm so much happier not having to go to this job that I don't really like. And what I really want to do is theater, or what I really want to do is make music or paint or walk puppies for a living, whatever it is. If someone, let's say in their 40s or 50s or even 60s, doesn't matter. If someone older goes, this is what I want, this, I'm finally realizing this is my dream and this is what I want to go for. What advice would you give someone like that?
I think that like a huge asset that anyone has that has just lived on the earth for longer is just having more connections, especially to kinds of people that do all different things. And so I think a huge asset that people, who are any age, but especially older people can bring is who are the people that who love theater, who are not actually professionally working on it, and how are they able to kind of help the things that you said, like creating those new shows or new projects. And so much of being a producer is finding the audience members and the investors and all of that. So with any creative endeavor, figuring out how to use your network to make it happen is a huge part of it. And that can mean like, oh, I have a friend who's a lawyer and they can help me create a contract for a new project I want to do. Or here are the kinds of people I can draw on for marketing to create my audience. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a huge asset that people who are older have. But I also think that just the knowledge that you have as you get older about what you want to do is, so informative. And, you've covered a lot of it. I think just being able to know what you're passionate about is like step one.
And it's amazing to me to watch people do that. I'm seeing people doing it right now that, oh, this is what I'm really passionate about. I'm going to go see what the possibilities are, even though 6 months ago, 4 months ago, they would have never thought to do that. So I think we're headed for an interesting cultural evolution. I won't say revolution, but I think it's going to be a cultural evolution. And it's interesting to me that you said about finding other people. What we started this whole conversation with was, what does a producer do? And I think that some people were informed a little bit when the TV show Smash was on,
Yeah.
because Angelica Houston's character, that's what she was doing. She was producing. And it was interesting to watch her sort of have, she had these closed door meetings with investors, and she had to be part of the rehearsal process, and she had to look at the bottom line and the dotted line of everything. How close was what they showed in the TV show to what you do as a producer?
I love Smash so much, and anyone who follows me on social media knows that I loved it while it was happening. I love it now. I was such a huge fan of it, and I think it was so essential to bringing new people into, what Broadway does. But one thing I always thought was interesting was like the theater community had this huge need for the show to be accurate and like a documentary. And I found it funny because, my dad is a doctor and my dad loves Scrubs, but when he watches Scrubs, he doesn't expect it to like teach people how to do heart surgery, It was this thing where, people would be like, that's not what that actor would do in that moment of a rehearsal. And I would be like, it's a television show. Like, it made me so like interested and also frustrated that that existed. But I understand why it did, because people want their art form to be represented correctly, and they also are interested, like you said, in knowing, like, is that actually what a producer does? Is that actually what a workshop's like? And the answer is like yes. Like the show did show a lot of accurate things, but it dramatized them to create a fictional story. So certainly, like, it wasn't the way that you would understand what a producer does if you were reading a book or watching a documentary. But the idea is that hopefully Smash opens a door so that someone who enjoys it does read a book or watch a documentary, and that adds to, their knowledge.
And that right there the perfect answer. It's like, yeah, it's fictionalized, and it's not necessarily the most accurate representation, but maybe it opens the door for someone to get curious and go, "Who? Let me see what it might actually be like." Because they weren't, it's kind of like looking at Glee. Glee similarly was not trying to show you that in 3 days this choir, who none of whom could actually read music, could come up with perfect choreography, perfect 4 or 5 part arrangements of this song that they just started learning, which whenever I watched Glee, I would always cringed at that, because what ended up happening was that a lot of people who came to me for voice lessons ended up thinking that that's how they could learn the songs that they were trying to learn. And I was like, these people are all really, they're musical geniuses. The fact that they can do this in 3 days, it's just not possible. So this idea in Smash of some of this is exactly what you do, and some of it is not at all, and it's to tell a story. And that's what Glee was like to me, is they were ultimately telling a story. But if they were real people, they'd all be musical geniuses, because they could do this incredible choreography and incredible singing and incredible arrangements in 45 minutes. It just, realistically it doesn't happen, but it makes for good television. So when you watch Smash, when you were looking at Bombshell or Hit List was the name of the other show, in looking at them as potential Broadway shows, what would you do to bring them to fruition? If you were the producer, if you were Angelica Houston's character, if you were doing it, what would you do to bring them, to put them up?
Well, first of all, I did produce Hit List, which was like one of the first things I did at 54 Below. So we have that hands-on experience.
Woohoo! That's great. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I worked with Josh Safran, who was the showrunner of season 2 of Smash, and with one of the writers of Smash, Julia Brownell, and we put together an actual musical stage version of it with Chris Rodriguez and Jeremy Jordan and Andy Mientis, and a fantastic team. And it happened right after Smash ended, and we put it on stage. But the fact is that if those fictional musicals are doing what they're supposed to within another story, then they don't actually have the pieces built to be an actual musical. Because picture if you were telling the story of Smash, like telling the fictional story of how a musical got made and using Hamilton, it wouldn't be satisfying because you would want to actually understand what was going on in a way that you couldn't, because that material does not get, you can't just like pluck it in. So much of the time when fictional musicals are put into, behind the scenes movies or TV shows, they actually have to function in a different way than an actual musical would. So if you want to put them on stage, you really have to create from scratch an actual show. There's actually a book that I think it's called When Broadway Went Hollywood, that's really about this, and how when backstage movie musicals started being successful was when they started realizing that you really couldn't have a show within a show be a book musical. It had to be a review so that you weren't following two plots at the same time. There's something so interesting in that to me because, yeah, I mean, to put Bombshell or Hit List on stage, you have to basically start from scratch and go, okay, we have some of the songs, and they functioned in a different way in Smash, and we have to turn them into a real musical.
And I didn't I may have read that you put Hit List on, but I didn't recall reading that. So that's so cool that you did that. And this idea, what you just said about telling a story within a story and how two plot lines are hard for people to follow. What's different? Is it that you just remove the entire sort of televised plot for Hit List and then just told the story of Hit List when you put it up at 54 Below? Is that what how did that work? What was the flow of that?
Yeah, well, in order to, as mentioned, like kind of do it during Smash, like the reason that Bombshell is about Marilyn Monroe is because people are supposed to have this base idea of like, okay, we know who she was. We have all of these understandings of different elements of her personality or her life that get us into those moments in the show, so that what we're focusing on is the, 60 characters creating Bombshell. And we're not going, who's Marilyn Monroe? It's
Right.
that. And so what's interesting about Hit List is that it used archetypes of, characters in the stuff that we saw in season 2 of Smash, and what we did was take the bones of story that were created for Hit List that made it kind of make sense within Smash, and expand on that to put an actual script to it. So we used the songs, which, as Joe Iconis, who I collaborate with all the time, wrote Broadway Here I Come and the Goodbye Song, which were in Hit List, and then Pasek and Paul, Andrew McMahon. There were all of these writers who had songs in Hit List that we took and then crafted into an actual stage story.
Wow, I'm sorry. Is there video of this? I would have loved to have seen it. I didn't know about it, but then I wasn't in New York
Yeah.
yet, so.
Oh my gosh. It was, well, that's the thing. It was so many years ago. At this point, it's interesting. But yeah, no, it's all online. Actually, we put it online. We were able to put a lot of the video clips of songs on, but during quarantine, we were able to put the whole thing online. So it should be up now.
Oh, where is it? Please tell me I'll put that in the show notes because that would
Yeah.
be
It's
amazing.
on YouTube. I think you can really find it by just searching Hit List from Smash.
Oh,
Or
that's terrific.
yeah.
Yeah, I'll put that for sure in the show notes because the songs on the songs on Hit List. Don't get me wrong, I love the songs on Bombshell, but there was something much more. This sounds a little odd, vibrant, I guess, for this in the songs on Hit List, and they drew me like crazy. And Krista Rodriguez's big song when she's hanging from the
Yeah.
from I don't at the moment recall the name of the song, but I love that song. That was on in 2014. That was on repeat on on my iPod. Um, I love that song. So let me. I know just a couple more questions. I keep saying that. So if you were gonna think about what is the best thing about getting to produce a show? What is the best thing?
I think because, I love theater so much, and I love this performer or this writer or this song, just the ability to share that with other people by making it happen. I obviously, Jonathan Larson has been so influential to me, and the original company of Rent and all of that. And, I just think about at 54 Below getting to program, Adam Pascal and Anthony Rapp on stage together, reunited singing from Rent, and
Wow.
seeing audience of, people every night having that experience, and giving them something that if they were like me and loved Rent and got to see it, or if they're, loved it and didn't get to see it, like creating a live performance that shares what you love. And sometimes that means like introducing a writer to a performer, and sometimes it means reuniting people and that already know each other, or creating something new on stage. But whatever it is, it's just being able to like have an audience experience what you love and have them walk away with like joy from experiencing it. I think that's what hits me.
Oh, that's lovely. What a beautiful and all-encompassing answer. And so now let's take a look at the other side of that coin. What's the most challenging thing about this work?
I reading a lot of the books I've been makes me just think about how universal this is. But it's like the reason why musicals can become so volatile behind the scenes is that they're so specific in that most shows, and I'm saying musicals a lot, but I really mean plays and anything you see on stage. I just work on musicals more. It's almost every show you see is the result of like years and years of work from so many different people with different visions, even if they're working in the same room. Nobody is the same person. And so you have with theater, here's this rehearsal we have, and it's taking place at 11 p.m. at night. And the decision we make now can affect whether this show gets a good review and whether it is something that people remember 10 years from now or 50 years from now or not. And so the pressure on an initial production of a show is so gigantic. And there's no editing after, it's not something that you can create and then work on later. Whatever you present live to an audience is the thing that exists. So there's just such pressure with so many different elements and such a pressure cooker of time and space with theater, that I think is always a challenge, and it's what makes theater so electric and so compelling for people, and it also is like endlessly difficult too.
It's funny that you said that. It's compelling, it's electric, and it's difficult. And I think there's a saying something like nothing good comes easy, but there is something to me about the difficulty of as an actor, as a performer, of pushing yourself to really dig deep and find the raw points of your character. And I wonder, as a producer, do you do the same thing? Is there some part of you that's digging deep to find that pinpoint, that most poignant moment within the show? Like you said earlier, it was about shows that are about real people really strike you. And so are you doing that when you're producing a show? Are you looking for that? And if so, what happens when you find it?
Yeah, that makes me think about something that I've been like ruminating on recently, which is like in history, I think a lot of them, and there's exceptions to this, like with anything, but with a lot of the most successful landmark musicals of, all time, like the chorus lines, the Hamiltons, the Oklahomas, like shows we've been talking about, they're the result of like clashing collaborators and also like risky elements. And that's the exact same thing that some of the shows that are like technically the biggest not successes are also comprised of. The Merrily We Roll Alongs, like the shows that close quickly. It takes such huge risks to create shows that are both of those things. And the shows that, basically are comprised of like not risky elements and not, very, very disparate teams create the stuff in the middle. And so I think that, not to say that shows that run a short period of time aren't as worthy, but it's just that I think that they have a lot more in common with the biggest hits than the shows in the middle do. That's just something interesting about theater to me. And as a producer, you're thinking about like, what are the ways we can challenge an audience and challenge ourselves to create something new? And that may, make something nosedive, and that might create something that like bursts open the art form. But if you take the not risky option, like chances are you're only going to end up in the middle. So I think that's something that is fascinating about theater that I don't think is really true of many other industries.
That's so fascinating that you said that. And yet here's something that's compelling to me right now as you said it. For you, it sounds like they're the ones that didn't have the long runs, the ones that close quickly. That's something it sounds like you want to shine a light on as well. Specifically, I mean, you've produced shows about that. So is it that grain of greatness that makes you go, they took risks and this is what I want to highlight. I want to highlight what is spectacular about this show that closed within 2 weeks or had, 2 nights or whatever. what is it that makes you go, these are the ones I want to highlight? What about the show and what about the writers makes you want to do that?
100%. It's a lot of what you said, that you look at something that might not have had like a huge life or a huge audience at a certain point and go, oh, there are so many people who would love, this character or this song or this, risk that they took in a way that I think they would appreciate if they got to be presented with it. But a huge part of it also to me has always been that, I don't think that there are bad pieces of art. I think there's art that you like and art that someone else is going to like. And
Mhm.
there are plenty of shows that are not my thing, but that I can go, oh, that person would love that. Or, it's art is personal in that way. And so, there are so many shows that I think are hits that I don't like or flops that I do like and vice versa. It's just really a matter of personal taste. And I think that art is stronger when people can have that for themselves and cannot associate like good things run a long time, bad things don't. And it's so much more complicated. And so I think that like spreading that is a big part of why I want to shine a light on it. So someone goes, oh, right now as we chat, I'm staring at a poster for The Goodbye Girl, which is, definitely
Oh.
love that show. And I know so many people that love that show, and they have to be given the opportunity to discover it in order to love it. And maybe some people hate that show, and that's fine too. And maybe some people hate, Cats, which ran for a very long time, or love it. And it's just that the length of run of a show is not what dictates its worth.
Oh, absolutely, and it's so interesting that you said goodbye. I love that show. So with shows like The Goodbye Girl, when they are very specifically, again, about real people, what what makes them what makes them special to you? What makes you go, that show? What is it about the shows about real people that makes you do that? Because you said that earlier, and you said it shows that are about real people really thrill me. So what is it? What is it about them that makes you go, this is what I want?
I think that, and you mentioned Wicked, which is so interesting because I do love Wicked. It's definitely like an exception to my like this should have really happened rule. And I think that's because the characters are grounded in such, real emotions and real, connections with each other. But, I think it's that for me as someone who loves musical theater writers so much, being able to really glimpse someone writing personally and authentically comes across when it's a show about real people in a way that it might not if it isn't. By which I mean, like, when we get to see falsettos and see, like, those people in sneakers singing about their experience and their lives, I feel like we're seeing Bill Finn at his like most authentic. And a
Mhm.
lot of the times I find that when you're seeing a writer create a musical about like, and this isn't always true, but like superhero heroes fighting a zombie apocalypse, or a musical based on a movie that has nothing to do with their real life and is fantastical, like there's just too many steps of remove. And I feel like when I see writers creating things about real people, there's just a sense of like authenticity that, and again, it's not always true, but I think that it creates something real, that I just like organically respond to.
I love that, and I love the idea of creating something that an audience can organically respond to. There are so many shows that other people hate that I'm like, "I love this show." And I think part of it is that there's somebody that I really, one character maybe, or one song that really speaks to me, that I really relate to, and that will make me a loyal fan for life. And it's that idea of bringing that in and putting productions up like that will give people more exposure to it, which I think is terrific. That's so great that you do that kind of work. But I know as a writer, you also have done a ton of interviews. And so a couple last questions, I promise. If you could have any dream interview with one of the greats on Broadway, who would it be and why?
I've thought about this a lot because at this point, I've interviewed a lot of people who are in the books who've sadly passed on. And so getting the opportunity to chat with them and to help them, have their stories live on in some small way has been such a like mind melding part of the experience. And so I've definitely been like, oh, I almost interviewed Mary Rogers, who I love very much and really, worship her work before she passed. And I unfortunately didn't. So it's like, who are those people that I wish I had gotten and didn't? And how do I talk to those people now? Because everything is, temporary and transient. And so I don't know who my dream interview is, who I haven't, but who's like still with us. I should think about that. It's a great question. But I definitely have like my list of like, I wish that I could sit at a table with like Mary Rogers and, Michael Bennett and Peter Allen and Bob Fosse
Mhm.
and Wendy Wasserstein, like the dream interviews that never were. And that inspires me to think about like who I want to interview now and kind of chase those people down.
And I think it's a great idea as you do more untold stories books. There's so many people who have this sort of institutional knowledge, this historical knowledge that it would be so great to get their perspectives and their stories told. And it sounds a little weird like before they pass, but it's true. The more people who have been there and walked that road that we can hear their stories, the more it informs our hearts and our minds forever. And I think there's something so powerful about that. I have just, again, a couple questions. So, books. I know you're reading tons of books. If you could recommend three books that you think people really ought to read because they love the theater or to spark a love of theater, what would those books be?
Three of my absolute favorite books, and obviously I have a lot, but three of the ones that I recommend most are Not Since Carrie, which is by Ken Mandelbaum, and it definitely addresses a lot of what we've been talking about today. Not Since Carrie was like hugely influential to me because it really goes into depth about so many musicals that were underappreciated in their time. It talks about shows that played less than 300 performances on Broadway from the 50s through the 90s. But when I
Mhm.
say in depth, I also like mean it's like juicy, it's fun, you get like fascinating stories about like the people involved, the plots, all that happened, and every page you're like, oh my god, what, oh my god, what. So it's just a fun read, and it's also like really informative about musicals as an art form while looking at the ones that didn't run for very long.
Mhm.
And then Everything Was Possible, The Birth of the Musical Follies by Ted Chapin is a huge one for me as well. Ted is like, a theatrical great in our industry, but when he was like about 20 years old, he was basically an intern on the original production of Follies, and he kept diaries about it that he then turned into a book many years later. And
Wow.
it's a fascinating, look inside a theatrical process of a musical that ended up being really, important. And then the third one is much more rarely heard of, and that's a book called Underfoot in Show Business by Helene Hanff. And that book really rocked my world because basically Helene Hanff, who, was a very successful playwright and writer later in life, wrote a memoir by a theater kid who wasn't famous, but she did this in the 40s. So basically, you're reading about, like so many aspiring theater people now, or, theater professionals that were once that way. You're seeing that from the perspective of someone who, like, stamped all the exclamation points on the program for Oklahoma while she was working in the press office.
Wow.
Um, and it's just such an amazing, fun, and fascinating book about like coming up in the theater, but in a different era.
Oh, that sounds amazing. All three of those, I'm going to put them right on my library list right now as soon as we get off this chat. So then, for you, for you, how do people find you? Where can people go and find Jennifer Ashley Tepper? Because I know you're going to have tons of new fans after this. Where do people find you? How do they get a hold of you?
I'm on both Twitter and Instagram at Jen Ash Tep. And yeah, I mean, I have loved the way that both like Twitter and Instagram have allowed me to like spread Broadway history and present love in the community, and like how so many other people are doing that too. So at Jen Ash Tep, that's where I'm at.
Perfect. And do you have a website?
Yeah, JenniferAshleyTepper.com.
Okay, because I'm going to put both of those on the show notes so that people can see your work and get to know what you're doing better and to learn more about the history of theater, which I think is fabulous. And one last question: uh, if if you had a plane, a skywriting plane, and it could write something that the entire world would see, what would you say?
I feel like so many of us right now, my first instinct to respond to that was that it should say wear a mask. Very specific to the time that we're living in. But yeah, there's no theater and there's no arts without people and without people being healthy. And so right now, like that has to be our focus. So I think that would be my answer.
That's
What would
great.
your answer be?
My answer would probably be kind. That
It's
would
a
probably be my answer.
very good answer too.
Yeah, that's it's funny, out of all the interviews I've done, and that's the last question I ask for everybody I do an interview with, And no one's ever asked me what my answer would be. So thank you for asking that. But yeah, it probably would be kind. That would be the yeah. Yeah. I mean, I could go the whole follow your dreams, but I think honestly, kindness is paramount. So Jennifer, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. Is there anything else that you think people ought to know? Is there any last bit of wisdom that you'd like to, before we sign off? Is there anything else?
No, we've covered such a wide variety of things. I thank you so much for having me. Like, this was such a fantastic chat.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad. Yeah, I'm delighted that you were able to take time to do this because this is I mean, theater is so close to my heart. I actually was when I first I graduated from the University of Michigan. When I first graduated, I was all set to move to New York. I was gonna work to be in the theater, and then money ran out, and I lost my apartment, and I lost my job, like both in the same day before I even moved here, and
Oh,
and ended up in DC, living on a friend's floor. So theater is really, really close to my heart. So it's so wonderful to get this beautiful perspective, and you bring such joy and effervescence to the theater, to your love for today, but also theater 100 years ago. And I'm really grateful that you're doing the work you're doing to help people learn, to help people get curious, to help people go and appreciate and participate and love musical theater and theater in general as much as you do, as I do. So I want to thank you for that.
thank you. Thank you for honestly being so wonderful at like understanding the creative process, being that, you're a creator yourself. I feel like this chat was like it percolated my brain about so many different topics.
Oh, yay. I'm so glad. Yeah, this is a labor of love for me. And it's because I want to highlight the work creatives are doing, but also I want to inspire people who might be afraid to become creative or to explore their creativity to try it, to open that part of themselves, because I think that to me, creativity is going to save the world. That's thinking creatively, thinking collaboratively, working together, doing creative things is gonna save us. So that's that's my goal anyway. So I want to thank you once again, Jennifer. I really appreciate you being here. And this has been and will continue to be the Creative Mindset Podcast. My name is Isolde Trachtenberg, and I'm super glad that you've been listening. I mean, how could you not have been? Jennifer's amazing. Find her, follow her. You're going to learn so much more about theater and the history of theater and beautiful, amazing projects. She's a mover and a shaper, and I'm very excited that she is here and doing this work. So until next time, if you like what you've heard, please consider leaving a review for the show, getting in touch and letting me know if there's something more or something different that you'd like to be hearing about, because I work with creative. I am an equal opportunity creative interviewer. So if you have other people that you'd like me to talk to, let me know who they are, because I think it would be great to have these conversations out there so that we can all learn and be nourished by them. Until next time, once again, this is Isolde Trachtenberg, and I send you all of my love. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here. Please subscribe to the podcast if you're new, and it would mean the world to me if you told a friend about it. Today's episode was produced by Isolde Trachtenberg and is copyright 2021. As always, please remember this is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Past performance does not guarantee future results, although we can always hope. Until next time, remember to be bold, be creative, and most of all, be kind.